Morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're residing at today. Before we get started, I want to express my sincerest gratitude to Elizabeth Tabor for organizing this special session on Clinical Trials Day. My name's Tasha Mosani, and I'm president and founder of RD Research Services, LLC. Today, we're going to talk about IRB considerations for the use of emerging technologies in clinical and behavioral research. I want you to bear in mind that though I made these two distinctions, these principles can be applied to both types of research. Now, a little bit about me before we dive into the learning objectives of today. I want to take a moment to highlight that I've worked over 6 years in human subjects research, HSR, and IRB, Institutional Review Board operations. During this time, I also managed two other major compliance areas, conflict of interest, or COI, and responsible conduct in research, RCR. I also support research study teams through their project lifecycle, including pre-application support and post-IRB approval submission efforts such as modifications, continuing review, and study closure. Now let's get into the learning objectives. By the end of this session, you'll be able to define research with human subjects warranting IRB review, list select emerging technologies used as interventions in clinical and behavioral research, identify critical protocol considerations and consent elements for IRB submissions, and finally, you'll be able to reinforce the emerging ethical themes prevalent in these emerging technologies. Before we can determine which type of projects warrant IRB review, we need to understand the federal definition of research. Research is a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Now, I want you to pay special attention to how I broke up this definition here. For a project to truly meet the federal definition of research, it must involve a systematic investigation, which is the process of gathering and analyzing information. Additionally, the research must contribute to generalizable knowledge. This means that the results of the research are disseminated to the broader community and contribute towards public knowledge of a particular area being researched. For example, if you're conducting a survey to improve some processes at your workplace and you didn't plan to disseminate these results broadly, this was just more of an internal process, this wouldn't likely warrant IRB review. However, like I just mentioned, if you wanted to share the results from this survey to the public via publication, then this quality improvement project would indeed be research. All right, so we defined research, so let's define a human subject. A human subject means a living individual about whom an investigator, whether professional or student, conducting research obtains information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction with the individual and uses, studies, or analyzes the information or biospecimens or obtains, uses, studies, analyzes, or generates identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. Now try saying that 10 times fast. That was a mouthful. So this term already has several federal definitions integrated within it. Instead of going through all this, through the sake of time, I want you to keep track of one key component. The key component here is that human subjects must be living individuals. So if you wanted to conduct secondary analyses on some post-mortem samples, this type of project wouldn't warrant IRB review. Again, human subjects must be living individuals. So we went over research, we went over human subjects, and now when we have research with human subjects, that's where institutional review boards or IRBs come into play. So IRBs review research studies to ensure that they comply with applicable regulations, meet commonly accepted ethical standards, follow institutional policies, and adequately protect human research participants. In short, if your project meets the federal definition of research and this research is being conducted on human subjects, the project will call for IRB review and approval. If you're located internationally, IRBs are typically referred to as research ethics committees and follow their own set of guidelines and regulations. The Office of Human Research Protections, or OHRP, which is under the Department of Health and Human Services, has compiled international standards that are used across the globe, and this was last revised in 2024. Now, this is a special treat. I didn't originally have this in the slides when I was going to present earlier this May, but I decided to add what I'd like to call a reinforcement check. So for those of you who are just seeing the recording, I'll go ahead and read through these cases with you, but I call this a reinforcement check because I want to gauge the temperature of everyone online to see if you saw these hypothetical projects, would you be able to know which warrants IRB review? So let's read each of these cases. So case 1. A study team wants to conduct a survey within their organization of employee satisfaction and burnout. They plan to use these results internally for quality improvement. Okay, so we have that. Now let's go to case number 2. A study team wants to investigate the effects of couples using chatbots for relationship advice. They plan to share results broadly to contribute to the psychology field. Okay, so that sounds pretty promising versus the first one where it says internal and quality improvement. So let's take a look at the third one. A study team wants to perform analyses on postmortem samples to understand the structural and chemical changes that are linked to patients who suffered a stroke. So if we go back to what we just learned, we know that if results aren't contributing to generalizable knowledge, in other words, they aren't disseminated broadly, then it doesn't warrant IRB review. And we also know that from the definition of a human subject that these must be living individuals. Therefore, the only plausible answer is case 2, because not only are these living individuals, they're also doing an intervention or interaction depending on how they're trying to investigate this, whether it's via survey or maybe they want them to interact with the bots and they want to see the couple's responses. Either way, they plan to share these results broadly to contribute to the psychology field. So that means this is human subjects research warranting IRB review. Now let's dive on in to the different emerging technologies. We covered what is research, what are human subjects, and what are IRBs, and projects that warrant IRB review. In other words, human subjects research. So before we start learning about these emerging technologies, I want to mention that these definitions are in accordance with the Food and Drug Administration. In other words, the FDA. So artificial intelligence, or AI, is a method that enables computer systems to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence. For example, recognizing patterns, learning from experience, drawing conclusions, and making predictions. While machine learning, a subset within AI, enables computers to learn without being programmed by humans. It is a set of techniques that can be used to train AI algorithms to improve performance at a task based on data. Now, the next emerging technology I want to talk about are wearable device technologies with mobile apps. Now, the FDA collectively refers to these as digital health technologies. So, digital health tools have the vast potential to improve our ability to accurately diagnose and treat disease and to enhance the delivery of health care for the individual. Digital health technologies use computing platforms, connectivity, software, and sensors for healthcare and related uses. These technologies span a wide range of uses, from applications in general wellness to applications as a medical device. Speaking of medical devices and AI, I wanted to quickly highlight this draft guidance that was issued earlier in January, just so we can see how these technologies intersect with one another. For example, this draft guidance here states that the FDA expects the device description of a pre-market submission must include training and tuning methodologies and data sets used in model development, including AI and ML learning techniques and evaluations, or any techniques and evaluations that rely on training and tuning the model to match one or more data sets. Additionally, to assist in determining the appropriate performance evaluation for your device, the FDA strongly recommends early engagement via the Q submission program, where detailed feedback specific to your device can be obtained prior to initiating studies. For example, there may be additional clinical performance evaluation considerations for devices incorporating AI and ML learning techniques. Further, there may be additional sample size considerations for incorporating AI and ML techniques into these devices. Okay, so the last set of emerging technologies that we're going to cover was augmented reality, AR, versus virtual reality, or VR. AR is a real-world augmented experience with overlaying or mixed simulated digital imagery with the real world as seen through a camera or display, such as a smartphone or head-mounted or heads-up display, HUD. Digital imagery may be able to interact with real surroundings, often controlled by users. This is sometimes where it's referred to as mixed or merged reality. Now, virtual reality, or VR, as it sounds, is a virtual world immersive experience that may require a headset to completely replace a user's surrounding view with a simulated, immersive, and interactive virtual environment. Some real-world examples of AR and VR applications already being used to treat patients include an AR system that overlays medical images onto a patient during an operation to help guide the surgeon's technique, or a VR system that is used to treat post-traumatic stress disorder in Army veterans. But where else can we see AR and VR in practice? We can see this impacting medical devices used to treat patients in mental health, pain management, and so much more. All right, now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty, to the meat of the slides, the meat of the presentation. So before we begin, I'd like to add a disclaimer that these are only some considerations with respect to the protocol and the consent form for these technologies. This is not meant to be an all-inclusive list, but the resources at the end of the presentation can serve as building blocks from when you're designing experiments of this nature in the future. First and foremost, the study team must consider regulatory oversight of the study. Let's look at examples such as the Department of Defense. As a former IRB reviewer, if I'm reviewing your study and I see that your study is sponsored by the DoD, the Department of War now, a potential clarifying question I would have is that, was this AI tool designed in alignment with DoD AI ethical principles? The study team should always be mindful of sponsor requirements. If you were to have unfunded research, I would review your study against institutional policy to ensure that adequate participant protections are met. Next, you'll want to clarify the overall intended use of the tool and whether the tool is meant to drive or inform decisions. AI tools designed to drive decisions versus inform decisions are generally classified as a higher risk. Then, the study team should review the data sources for their AI tool to ensure a fair selection of participants. This is directly referred to as the justice principle in the Belmont report. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is, were participants identified based on the scientific goal of the study? Were participants of different ages, gender, sex, racial backgrounds considered to avoid selection bias? For the next consideration, the study team should be clear in the type of data the team wishes to analyze and ensure the research aligns with applicable privacy regulations. For example, were you aware that the EU AI Act has different rules for different risk levels? It's certainly an enlightening read, and I encourage you to review this if this is applicable to any of your research as it becomes enforceable in August 2026. Further, you may not be aware, but are you aware of the EU General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which is the Data Protection Law Enforcement Directive? And then there are certain rules within that for the protection of personal data. And this is very much why I love doing what I do. My role, such as many of yours that are online listening to this recording today, involves continuous education. I will forever be a student of my craft. Now, I know you can't really show your hands since this is a recording, but I want you to imagine or think about if you're familiar with Gordon Moore's law. Well, for those that haven't heard of Moore's law, it's the observation that the number of transistors in an integrated circuit doubles about every 2 years. In other words, this law is a projection of a historical trend. Intel is apparently the semiconductor company that has continuously innovated more and more transistors onto every smaller chip to maintain the pace of Moore's law for decades. So with that mindset, it's important to note that the proposed AI tool is updated based on these trending technological advances. Now, when participant data is being entered into a novel AI tool, signed/document consent is absolutely required. Whether via physical signature or electronic signature, signed consent must be obtained from all participants affirming that they agree to be part of the study, and that is, they are agreed to having their data entered into the AI tool, this novel tool, for research purposes. As previously mentioned, regulatory oversight is important if your study is federally sponsored. For example, the FDA has standard consent language that must be added into the consent forms for studies of this nature. Similarly, with privacy laws such as the EU GDPR requires standard consent language to be provided to participants in addition to the consent form from your institution in order to explain the rights that participants have with respect to the privacy of their data. Again, in order to relay all this information in the consent form, study teams can be creative here. You can use graphics, tables, or any sort of visualization that you think that will help understand in plain language the purpose of this AI tool and the specific data points you're trying to collect. It is very important that the participant comprehends this process, because the consent process is all about providing accurate key information that will provide the foundation for the participant to be autonomous, in other words, independent, and decide to participate in the proposed research. Similar to how your phone indicates an update is required, You should also state if there are any technological advances in the proposed device, model, or technology that participants will be informed of these changes. Finally, just because I very much love AI, I have to do a small plug from where I learned this information from. So if you're in the IRB or human subjects world, you may have heard of one of the primary AI thought leaders in this space, Tomiko Ito. Tomiko from Technology and HSR, and my former Primer mentor, which if you're not a part of Primer, they have excellent resources for IRBs. Tamiko has created many free, and I emphasize free resources for IRB compliance programs to build robust AI policies and reviewing procedures. I've included her website as reference to review at the end of the presentation. All right, so the remaining technologies, we have wearables and mobile apps, AR and VR. So if you remember, I mentioned that they all require some sort of, well, a wearable. So in other words, something you wear, whether it's a device or a headset. Not that I did this for research purposes, but I remember having a VR headset where I was a ninja. And I thought it would be a grand idea to simulate this in a very small room where I had my bed and my dressers that could easily be in the way and potentially harm me when I'm doing a kick or something. I quickly learned, though I'm not meant to be a ninja, I am meant to tell you this. In all seriousness, if these are truly wearables, does this mean that they have the same protocol and consent form considerations? Yes, but no. Let's see what I mean by that. You will notice the first bullet point under protocol section will have a recurring theme. This is something your IRB must know if it is a novel tool that you've designed. I don't care if it's AI, if it's a wearable, VR, AR, if it's something novel you designed, not only does this need to be stated in your protocol, but also to participants in the consent form so they know what they're consenting to. And then, of course, we want to ensure that we're being mindful of inclusion criteria and fair selection of potential participants. And as far as wearables and mobile apps, the key risk here that we think about are related to data privacy. So if there are any third-party apps, where's the information going? And then we also care about any physical risk. So we have to wear, for example, something equivalent to a Fitbit that could cause skin irritation. Now moving on to the consent form, you'll also see this recurring theme here that your protocol and your consent form, as a matter of fact, all your IRB applications should be in line with one another and they should be consistent. So, as we'll see here as a recurring theme, signed consent is required. You should provide a clear description of the proposed tool and what specific data will be collected. I always like to encourage teams to use a table or a chart to explain the wearable, such as features including instructions and use, care and troubleshooting. And also, if it's not a novel tool or app, I strongly encourage research teams to include the mobile app and device privacy policies for participants to review. Not necessarily insert the policy within the consent form, but just a link to it so that participants can visit it and understand better. Finally, you should also indicate to participants when to stop their data sharing with the study team. In other words, when to uninstall the app. Now, if we go to our next slide here. Oops, did I? All right. So now we're on AR. Since AR collects data about their participants capturing the existing world, potential data capture can include intimate details such as biometrics, including facial expressions, speech, retina patterns, and what individual people in the AR environment are seeing and or hearing. To mitigate this risk, participants should be made aware of how to download the AR platform, including proper settings for setup, how to use the platform, how to securely remove the platform, information about what the platform accesses on the participant's device, folders, camera, photos, GPS, etc., information about data that is being recorded about the individual via the application shared with a third-party app, and what data is used as research data. All this should be mentioned within the protocol and consent form, and they should be consistent with one another. That's very important. They need to equal each other. As for physical location risk, the participant may not be aware of their surroundings and they could potentially trip and injure themselves, which is why I mentioned my ninja story earlier, though that was related to virtual reality. To mitigate this risk, the study team should properly monitor the participant at all times. So whether you set aside a certain area for participants to perform this intervention, and you have some cones staked out, just something to where you know, okay, if the participant's getting out of scope here, we just need to make sure that they're back in the safe space. And again, I don't want to read the slide here, but again, signed consent is required. And like I mentioned before, you always want whatever considerations are in the protocol with respect to participants, those absolutely need to be mirrored in the consent form. All right. What should I think about when using VR as an intervention? We're almost through the slides, everybody. Physical risks are contingent on the equipment used, such as cyber sickness, where symptoms consist of a headache, feeling dizzy or lightheadedness, sudden drowsiness or fatigue, vision issues, nausea or vomiting, triggering of seizures or other conditions due to visual effects, injury from tripping, falling, or colliding with physical objects, and potential contagions from sharing head-mounted displays. So these are the physical risks that we typically see within VR-related studies. Mitigation measures for these risks stem from defining specific inclusion criteria. In other words, you really want to have a sound pre-screening process. So the screening process serves not only as a point to specify participant inclusion criteria, but also exclusion criteria. Exclusion of pre-existing conditions and states that may increase the likelihood of VR side effects, such as history of motion sickness, nausea, migraines or headaches, balance coordination issues, dizziness, or epilepsy. If a participant has a history of anything like that, they probably shouldn't participate in your study, and this is something that needs to be mentioned as an exclusion criteria so that if a person comes across your study, wherever it's being advertised, they know, okay, I have motion sickness or I get dizziness from time to time. I probably shouldn't participate in a study like this. Other exclusions of persons could be from temporary conditions that will impair data collection in a virtual environment. These also need to be taken into account, such as having active alcohol or illicit drug use, or a hangover and flu. Whatever the case may be, if it can skew your data, you want to make sure that this is an exclusion requirement. Let's see here now. What's the next point we want to get out here? The study team should monitor the participant at all times, as well as clean the VR device after each use. Participants should also be reminded that if they are feeling unwell, that they should stop the immersive experience immediately. At this point, the study team can ask if the participant wishes to continue with the immersion or if they want to withdraw. The study team should also conduct welfare checks for particularly long experiments, as participants may not see the early onset of potential illness such as cyber sickness. Okay, so this is meant for if we were discussing live, but I want you to just think about for yourself, what are some of the differences specifically in the consent form when it comes to these different wearables and technologies? Now, I know there are a lot of recurring themes, such as mentioning the risk and how to mitigate those risks, but what are the difference between the mitigation measures and the different types of risks that you'll see within these different types of wearables? Okay, we covered a lot of ground here today, and I want to commend you for standing by for the grand finale. As a recap, we talked about research with human subjects warranting IRB review, various emerging technologies used in human subjects research, as well as protocol and consent form considerations for these technologies. However, if you look closely enough, you can see that there are strong emerging ethical themes for all these technologies. First piece of the puzzle is reliability. The purpose of the emerging technology and its intended use must be made clear, whether it's in the protocol or consent form. Next, we have fair selection, which is what we've already described, using scientific rationale to target the population of interest and avoiding selection bias. Third is transparency. Study teams must be transparent in terms of how the tool was developed, in other words, what data sets were used to train the model, and what data will be collected from participants. And finally, we have governance. Governance refers to the policies, regulations, and ethical guidelines that oversee the development, deployment, and use of these emerging technologies. It ensures safeness, fairness, and respect for human rights in research and in application. These bare ethical essentials guide us when we design studies of these nature using emerging technologies. And that's the end of today's presentation. Thank you so much for joining me. You're welcome to reach out to me at any time with any questions you may have. I left my email on there. The last couple slides are just referring to the references and resources that I was talking about earlier. Thank you so much, and I hope you found this useful.